It is my pleasure to introduce to you Apo Hyvarinen. He is currently a professor at the University of Helsinki in computer science. He's also been a professor at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit in the University College of London from 2016 to 2019. Apo has really played a key role in advancing approaches based on independent component analysis. He wrote the book called Independent Component Analysis in 2001, which I learned a lot from. Another one called Natural Image Statistics. He has, contributed a lot to various machine learning and computational workshops and conferences as area chair. And he has really been an inspiration to a lot of us. And so he's going to be talking today about nonlinear independent component analysis and its applications to EEG and MEG. So welcome, Apo, and it's a pleasure to have you joining us at the BrainSpace Initiative.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Vince. Yes, so I'm really going to talk today about something which is still independent component analysis, but a little bit different. That is nonlinear independent component analysis. And I will talk a little bit about applications to EEG and MEG, since I understand this is a neuroscience audience mainly. But unfortunately, actually, fortunately or unfortunately, the talk is actually rather theoretical, I have to say. Okay, but I will try to keep it to show the neuroscience implications. So I will start by a short introduction.
You have a lot of algorithm developers and engineers on here too, so you have a pretty mixed audience. So
okay, very good. Yes, okay. So yes, as you can see, we have some technical problems with this web system. So I'm actually not showing the slides myself. It's Armin who is showing them. So there may be. I apologize if there are some problems. But anyway, so I will start the talk by a short introduction to deep learning, and I will emphasize the importance of unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, people often talk about deep learning, and people talk about disentanglement, which is kind of a rather vaguely defined term, which means something like methods trying to find independent factors. So this, in the linear case, this has been done by independent component analysis, so ICA quite successfully. So then the question that I'm posing here fundamentally is whether and how we could extend this to a nonlinear method. Now, we immediately run into a problem, which is that nonlinear ICA, as opposed to linear ICA, is fundamentally an ill-defined problem in the sense that the model is not identifiable. But that's only in the basic case. Now, when we actually develop slightly more sophisticated cases, models, we will see that actually we can solve this identifiability problem by introducing temporal structure in the data. So utilizing a temporal structure in the data, different kinds of temporal structure. So that's kind of the most theoretical identifiability part. And then we will then use this temporal structure in various ways, some of which methods are self-supervised, which is a very fashionable way of doing unsupervised learning these days. Or then we have more principled maximum likelihood-based methods related to variational autoencoders. And yes, I will talk about applications to EEG and MEG here and there. Okay, so just a very short background on artificial intelligence or machine learning. Well, of course, we all know that we live in a kind of a boom era for artificial intelligence. There's a lot of industrial applications and also scientific applications. We actually encounter these in many ways. People talk a lot about autonomous vehicles, but of course, what we see in practice is things like search engines and recommendation machines that we tend to use all the time, sometimes without actually knowing that, and they are also based on AI. And actually, most of these modern applications, even search engines, even recommendation machines, are based more or less on deep learning. So next slide, please. Yes, okay, so deep learning, what it means is that, well, we basically approximate nonlinear functions by neural networks. So an idea of a neural network is that we have basically a rather simple function approximator, something where we just take a linear transformation and then simple nonlinearities, but we repeat this many, many times, and then we can, in the limit, approximate arbitrarily complicated nonlinear functions. And then, well, so fundamentally a neural network is basically just a function approximator, but then when we combine that with some kind of a statistical objective, in the simplest case, some kind of a least squares criterion, then we can learn. And that is basically deep learning, especially when we have many layers. Yes. So then the idea is that, well, if we just have, basically, if we just have enough data, then this kind of a system can learn any kind of an input-output relationship. So the most famous applications are where you get inputs are photographs, and then the neural network outputs the category, as illustrated in this in the figure below here. Or then you can predict stuff, predict the future by associating past and present, or then in the internet you can do all kinds of weird things, like predict a person's political views based on the friends, Facebook friends or something. So the present boom was really started by this paper by Grzybski, Sutskever, and Hinton in 2012, where this picture is from, where they showed that basically this kind of a deep learning network has superior recognition success of objects in this kind of photographs or images compared to any existing method. So next slide, please. Okay, but so what I'm going to talk about here is really unsupervised learning. So these typical cases for deep learning, the typical success stories need category labels. So basically you need input and output. So if you have an input that is photographed, then you need to know whether the output is a cat or a dog or whatever the category is, or whether some object is liked or not liked by a person. But next point, please. Yeah, but there are problems because, well, you may not have this kind of a labels, the outputs. Well, labels can be difficult to obtain. Maybe you need human annotation in the biomedical context, especially. Maybe you need a medical expert to tell which data is pathological and which is not, for example. And then again, the labels may not actually be extremely informative. They may be very noisy or something. So this leads to unsupervised learning, where the idea is that we only observe a data vector, many observations of a data vector or a big data matrix, but we have no idea of any kind of labels or targets or outputs. Why? For example, we could have just like a lot of photographs with no labels, or if you like, we could have just like a lot of EEG without any kind of labels. So this is basically a very difficult, largely unsolved problem. Sometimes when I go into theory, I actually argue that it's not even like a single problem, it's many different problems, and people haven't quite understood what a heterogeneous set of problems it is. But anyway, here let me just say it's a very difficult problem. Yes. Well, in the linear case, we have this nice solution given by independent component analysis. So here's the basic model of linear independent component analysis, where the idea is that we have a number of variables xi, where k is now some kind of observation index, possibly a time index, but not necessarily. It could be the index of a subject, for example. And this data is expressed basically as a linear combination of certain latent variables called independent components or sources, denoted by Sj. And so these latent sources are linearly mixed together to produce the observed data. And what we want to do is to basically find both the mixing and the original sources based on the X only. So next point, please. Yes. Okay. Thank you. No, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Now, the fundamental point here is that this ICA model is identifiable. That is a fundamental concept in this talk. What it means is that the model is well defined in the following sense, which is that when we only observe the X's, we can actually recover both the A's and the S's. Now, this is definitely not true for many different generative models, as I will explain later, but it is in particular true for ICA, and really it is fundamentally based on the fact, on the assumption that these independent components are non-Gaussian and also statistically independent. Next, please. So here's I will explain very briefly the fundamental difference between ICA and PCA. I mean, sometimes people think it's kind of the same thing because only one letter is different in the acronym. But now on the left, you see that we have like two independent components of uniform distributions. And the second from the left, second plot from the left shows the observed mixtures, that is the observed data X. Now, if we do PCA on the data, we get the third panel, which, as you see, is not at all equivalent or equal to the first one. So we don't actually recover the original components. But when we do ICA, we actually will recover exactly the original components, the right rotation. So the point is that PCA does not find the original coordinates. So PCA is not identifiable, while ICA is identifiable. So and this is actually something that used to be a major source of confusion. Maybe these days people start understanding it better, but often people applied PCA and also classical factor analysis based on a Gaussian assumption, hoping that they actually identify the original independent components, but that is not the case. In fact, if you had Gaussian data here in this example, you would find that any orthogonal rotation is completely equivalent, and you cannot distinguish between them based on the data only. And this is exactly what is shown here, what is seen here, that PCA actually recovers the data up to a rotation. Okay, so what this identifiability means in practice is that ICA can do what is called blind spot separation. So if we observe the 4 signals at the top, well, basically like parallel time series, well, they actually contain hidden in them some interesting signals. But if you do PCA, you will get the second row, which doesn't actually reveal anything interesting. But when you do ICA, you get the bottom row, and you see that actually the data consisted of interesting original sources. So this is identifiability, which enables blind spot separation. Yes, next, please. And so this has been applied on EEG and MEG several times. Here I'm just showing one of our applications, which was one of the first ones perhaps to apply ICA on resting state MEG data, reasonably raw MEG data. And we found actually we found several sources. Here's kind of a 9 most stable sources, some of which corresponds to meaningful, well-known sources like visual sources or Rolandic sources, some of which are a bit less known. So that's kind of, I think, the ideal case. We get some known sources, so we know that the method is doing something meaningful, but then we also get something completely new, which then prompts new experimental research. Yeah, next, please. Another application kind of unrelated to this is about calculating image features. Maybe I will skip that. So next, please. Okay, so what we would then like to do here is to do the same thing in a nonlinear case. So we, instead of having linear transformations, we have some kind of arbitrary nonlinear transformations, for example, modeled in practice by neural networks. So this is how we would get kind of a general disentanglement, as people say. But now here we run into the problem which is fundamental here, which is that a basic nonlinear version of ICA is not identifiable. So if we simply define a model like here, where xi, each observed variable, is some arbitrary nonlinear function of a number of independent components, well, we cannot recover the original sources. This is illustrated on the bottom line, on the bottom row here. So where we have, like before, we have 2 independent components, a bit of different distributions, and the scatter plot. And now the scatter plot is colored only for the purposes of this illustration. Now we take some nonlinear mixtures of these, given by the middle panel. As you can see, it's a very nonlinear transformation. And now we can actually, by a certain method I will explain in a minute, we can find independent estimates which are on the right-hand side. Now the point is that these estimates here exactly reproduce the distribution of the data. So statistically speaking, they are completely equivalent to the original sources. But as we can clearly see, they are not the original sources. And this is the problem the problem of identifiability. Even though you basically reproduce all the statistical properties of the data, you still you get a lot of possible estimates of independent components that are statistically exactly equivalent in the sense of reproducing exactly the distribution of the data, but they are just not at all the same. They are completely different estimates. So they are ill-defined. Next, please. Yeah, in fact, this impossibility was shown by Darmois a long time ago, the same Darbois who actually proved also the identifiability of the linear case. So he actually considered both cases already around 1950. So he proposed the following simple construction. Suppose we have two random variables, x1 and x2. Now you can always define a function g of x1 and x2, which is defined as the conditional probability distribution function as given by this equation. So now this output of g, so defined denoted by y here, is actually exactly independent of x1. So we see that independence alone doesn't actually allow any kind of identifiability, because we can take x1 or any of the observed variables and then construct a new variable which is exactly independent of that. So in that sense, we could kind of think that x1 is an independent component, which is absurd. We cannot arbitrarily say that one of the observed variables is an independent component. So independence alone is simply too weak to provide enough constraints. And well, in the theory of ICA, we of course always talk about linear ICA, we always talk about non-Gaussianity, but non-Gaussianity is particularly absurd in this nonlinear case, because you can always make a scalar transformation of your variables to achieve any distribution. So looking at any assumption or measure of non-Gaussianity doesn't help at all. And in fact, the three panels figures that I showed on the previous slide, which are reproduced here at the bottom, well, this was actually the right-hand side, the independent estimates were obtained by exactly this construction by Darbois. So next, please. But the situation is not hopeless, because in fact, the theory above, so the theory by Darbois, the theory of non-identifiability, it only considered random variables, which are IID samples. So basically, there is no temporal structure or any spatial structure, whatever, between the observations of X. It's a bit like, observing like data from different subjects where there is basically like no dependence. But of course, if you have time series, then you will have dependencies between the different vectors that you observe. So in fact, we have it has been shown by several people that the situation is much better when you have certain kinds of temporal structure. I will be talking about here about two different kinds of temporal structure. First, kind of well, actually, I will go through them in the opposite ordering. But historically, the first one that was considered was some kind of autocorrelations, already by Harmeling and others in 2003, which is well known. Or then we could have something like non-stationarity, which is illustrated here, which is kind of actually typical of MEG or EEG, where something like kind of the amplitude of the signal is changing smoothly as a function of time. So the variance is non-stationary, so to say. So in this case, then identifiability of nonlinear ICA can be proven, and this is takes what I'm going to talk about for much of the rest of this talk, really. So that means that with this kind of a temporal structure, we can actually recover the original sources. Okay, so what I will be using often here is an algorithmic trick called self-supervised learning. But this is really just an algorithmic trick which doesn't a priori have anything to do with nonlinear ICA. In fact, most people who do self-supervised learning have probably not even heard about nonlinear ICA, and there's no logical connection between these two. But it happens that certain methods for self-supervised learning actually are related to nonlinear ICA, as I will explain. So let me first explain what self-supervised learning is. So in the supervised learning, so what we have is input and output, something, for example, photographs or images and a label for the content, or in our case, perhaps we would have brain signals and experimental condition, or maybe some diagnostic category. Okay, but then next, please. But then, of course, as I explained in unsupervised learning, of course, we have only the X and not the Y. But now, so the self-supervised learning, what it means is we actually only observe the X, but then we somehow invent this Y by ourselves. So, for example, by creating corrupted data in various ways. And so then once we have invented the Y, then we can use ordinary supervised learning algorithms to find the connection between X and Y. And possibly, hopefully, then that will reveal us something about the structure of X and thus do some kind of unsupervised learning. For example, one simple way of doing self-supervised learning is something we proposed in 2010, which is that, okay, you take your real data X, and then you just artificially generate some kind of noise, like Gaussian noise. And then you train a neural network to discriminate between the real data and the artificially generated noise. And in order to do this properly, presumably, the neural network has to learn something about the structure of the data X. And yes, we have actually theory showing that it will, in fact, estimate a certain kind of a parametric model, a density approximation, and so on. But yeah, okay, so what I'm going to talk about here is two different kinds of self-supervised learning, mainly time contrastive learning and permutation contrastive learning, as you can see on the subtitles. So first, time contrastive learning. This was our very first method and very first result on nonlinear ICA, really. So the starting point is we observe an n-dimensional time series X. So we do have some kind of temporal structure. And so what we do is the following. We completely arbitrarily divide this X, the time series, into a number of segments. For example, just by taking bins of equal sizes, as is illustrated on the right. And then what we do is that we train a multi-layer perceptron, that is a neural network, to tell which segment each single data point comes from. So we have a simple classification problem where the number of classes is equal to the number of segments, and the labels are given by the indices of the time segments. So it's a simple multinomial logistic regression problem that we can solve with a neural network. Next, please. Now we can actually divide this neural network now into two parts. First, a kind of a feature extractor, which is everything that the neural network does until the last hidden layer, and then a last layer which actually does the multinomial logistic regression, but that is less interesting. Now the question is that what kind of features does the feature extractor have to extract? Well, now intuitively you would think that, well, the neural network should learn something about the differences between the segments in order to be able to do this classification. But the differences between segments, this difference of the distributions between the segments is exactly the same thing as the non-stationarity of the signal. Okay, so now the question is, does this actually do nonlinear ICA? And yes, yes, the next please. Yeah, so we actually have a theorem. So I will go rather quickly through this theorem. Okay, so it's been said that there's mathematical people here in the audience, so I will go through it to some extent. So the theorem says that, okay, let's assume that the data follows a nonlinear ICA model. So where we have these components which are non-stationary. For example, they might have non-stationary variances at big Gaussian. And then these are mixed by a smooth and invertible nonlinear mixing F, but otherwise we don't actually assume anything about F. It is kind of a completely general nonlinearity. Okay, and then we assume we apply time contrastive learning on this data with the hidden, so that the neural network has a hidden layer which has the same dimension as the dimension of the data. This is just a technical assumption, not really true in practice. So then what we can prove is that TCL will actually find the hidden layer H, or the hidden layer H will learn to be such that it is actually equal to a linear transformation with some linear mixing matrix of A so a linear transformation of the hidden layer is actually equal to the squares of the independent components. Next, please. So what that means is that TCL actually demixes the nonlinear ICA model up to a linear mixing given by this A. But then this linear mixing A can, of course, be estimated by linear ICA under some further assumptions. The only thing that remains is actually the squaring of the independent components, which we cannot resolve. In fact, the fact that it is square, it doesn't have to be squaring. It depends on the statistics of the data. The squaring comes from the assumption of Gaussian variances. But anyway, so what we have here is a constructive proof of the identifiability of the model. We show that this kind of a self-supervised learning, quite surprisingly actually, is able to estimate a nonlinear ICA model. It's surprising because it's not really like designed to solve this problem. It just happens to do so. But at the same time, so what it shows is that this model is identifiable based on this. The nonlinear ICA model is identifiable based on this non-stationarity structure. Now, if you think about intuitively, why would this work? Why does this temporal structure, why does the non-stationarity make the model identifiable? Well, basically, the point is that in a non-stationary model, you have different distributions in each segment, ultimately at each time point, actually. And now what we can do is that we can impose independence of the estimated components at every segment. So we get more constraints, and that is how we, in the end, get a unique solution. So we did some experiments on MEG on this early model. These are not the most interesting experiments, but I think they serve as a simple illustration. So we estimate independent components from resting state data. And then we validate the components so that we take another data set from the same subjects where people have been stimulated by different sensory modalities and with some rest interspersed. So we actually have four different labels now that we have, which is the stimulation modality, including rest. And so we can then train a linear SVM on the associates estimated from the resting state data, and we investigate whether this works by MLPs with different numbers of layers. And so in A, we see the results, which shows that, first of all, it shows that TCL finds better features than competing methods. Also, it shows that, well, when you actually make the system nonlinear, increase the number of layers in the neural network, you get better and better performance. Although in these early results, actually, the difference is not that great. Then, of course, in a neural network, the problem is that you get some kind of a black box approximator of a nonlinear function, but it would be really interesting from a neuroscience viewpoint to try to understand what kind of nonlinear it actually computes. But this is unfortunately a really difficult, pretty much unsolved problem. So I'm just reproducing here in B some figures that we plotted in the paper, trying to show how the processing progresses in the 3 layers. But this is really like a really unsatisfactory way of illustrating the nonlinearities, but nobody really knows how to do it properly. But so that's an interesting problem for future research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so very recently, we actually provided a much improved version of this idea, where we basically take into account temporal correlations as well, in addition to the non-stationarity, by using an autoregressive model. So everybody knows that MEG and EEG have strong temporal correlations. And you can fit, for example, an linear autoregressive model to the data. And it's a meaningful model. So what we now did is that we actually fit an autoregressive model, nonlinear autoregressive model, in fact, and then look at the innovations, that is the residuals in the autoregressive model, and model them by the nonlinear ICA model, assuming non-stationarity. So we have an autoregressive model with non-stationary residuals, which is then presumably a much more powerful method for MEG and EEG or any data which has both non-stationarity and temporal correlations. I will not go into details, but well, just look at the leftmost panel. So now this is a completely different set of data. But so what we do again is that we estimate. Well, in this case, we don't estimate. Features from resting data. We just estimate data from evoked response. We estimate the model from evoked responses and then see how it generalizes to separate sessions. And we see that our method, the new method IIA TCL on the left-hand side, gives better performance than the TCL that I just explained, or a competing method which is simply based on a conventional nonlinear autoregressive model. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then we have another very simple self-supervised learning method, which is based on a completely different, in fact, and it's in fact modeling a completely different kind of a temporal structure, which is actually temporal correlations or temporal dependencies in a stationary time series. So again, we have like an n-dimensional time series. Next point, please. So what we do now is that we actually take short time windows as the new data. In the very simplest case, we could just take two subsequent time points and say that this is the new data denoted by y. I shouldn't perhaps denote it by y because it's not the kind of a label that y used to be earlier. It should be another letter actually. But okay, here it's y. Okay, and then what we do is that we create another data set, which is kind of a randomized data set where we take time points which have no relationship to each other, in completely like random time points. So kind of a time shuffled or time permeated data where we break the temporal correlations or any temporal dependencies completely. And then what we do is that we train a neural network to discriminate between these two. So like real-time windows versus temporally shuffled time windows. Now it turns out that in fact, this kind of a system performs nonlinear ICA for temporally dependent components in stationary time series. We have a theorem just like in the previous case, but I'm not showing it here for the interest of brevity. Next slide, please. So what I will simply show is results of a simulation. So you remember this failed simulation where I had the Darmois construction where we get independent components, but not the real independent components because the model is not identifiable. So let's try again. Here we have actually exactly the same sources. I didn't tell you last time that in fact the sources did have time structure. The time structure was not used in the earlier case at all. But in fact, this data comes from non-Gaussian autoregressive models where we have actually Laplacian innovations as shown above. And we have the mixtures on the bottom left, just the same mixtures as earlier. But now we actually use the temporal structure and the theory of PCL, and what we get is on the bottom right-hand side. So you see that, well, this colored figure is actually a rather good reconstruction of the original sources with just some estimation errors, possibly local minima or whatever. I also showed scatter plots between the true sources and the the true sources and their estimates, and it's quite a good correspondence. Now, for comparison, we use this method by Harmeling and others, which was kind of the first paper trying to do something like this, trying to find independent components based on autocorrelations, and well, it doesn't actually work well at all. Okay, next slide, please. Now, we did actually clinical applications of methods related to PCL, and other methods related to PCL. We had two applications. One was sleep staging, where the idea is that we measure sleep EEG, and then there are experts who make staging. It's five different stages of sleep, and then we try to learn a neural network to do that classification. And in another data set, we have EEG, which is either normal or pathological in two different ways. So these are what I would call rather archetypal semi-supervised problems. So what semi-supervised learning means is that you basically have a lot of unlabeled data available, but finding labels is costly. For example, in this case, it needs a human expert. So you have only few data points for which you have labels, but you have huge amounts of unlabeled data. So this is a bit like what was alluded to earlier in this TCL MEG case, where we learn stuff from resting state, and then classify various kinds of sensory stimulation. There also, you could argue that, well, we get huge amounts of resting state from the internet, no problem. But then if we have any kind of specific kinds of sensory stimulation, then we don't have that much data. And especially it is the case here, where you actually need a human medical expert to do to any kind of a labeling. While it is obviously very easy to measure a lot of sleep EEG without any labels. So, well, the solution for this kind of a solution for this kind of a semi-supervised learning is obviously that you first find good features by unsupervised learning based on the unlabeled data, and then you use a simple classifier that doesn't have too many parameters, that is very easy to learn, that then classifies the data based on the sophisticated features learned by the unsupervised learning and the few labeled data points that you may have. So in this figure, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, but so on the left-hand side, we show the network architectures where we have convolutive layers and that kind of stuff. But so the main result is, I would explain it in the kind of a, let's say, this middle panel labeled titled PC18. So this is a sleep staging, if I'm not mistaken. So the idea is that, well, if you do ordinary deep learning in a completely supervised way, you get this curve. Sorry, these colors are very similar, but it is the curve that starts very low and then goes up. So what that means is that when you have this is a function of labeled examples per class. So if you have very few examples, you will not learn anything. But when you get a lot of examples, then you will learn well. Okay, but the self-supervised, the semi-supervised learning based on self-supervised learning is the curves that actually kind of under this green part, where basically you start even with a very small number of examples per class, even like just 1 or 10 examples per class, you already get some kind of a reasonable classification accuracy clearly above chance level, because you have very good features learned from unlabeled data. Then in the end, when you get more and more data, then in fact, the ordinary supervised learning will work just as well, maybe even better, in fact. But the point is that, well, in this regime where we have few labeled data points, the self-supervised learning helps a lot. So it's kind of the same story in both of these two applications. So next slide, please. Okay, I will then very briefly, so that was the self-supervised case. I will then very briefly explain something a little bit more theoretically sophisticated, which is where we go into deep latent variable models and maximum likelihood estimation. Now, well, people often talk about deep latent variable models. I mean, it's a very general concept, not in any way restricted to nonlinear ICA, obviously. So you can represent it in this very general way, where we have some latent vector S and observed data vector S, and then, well, we basically just say that, well, the joint likelihood can be expressed as a product of the prior P of S and the likelihood, the P of X given S. And you integrate out the latent variables and you get P of X, which is then the probability of X, and that gives you the likelihood of X. Okay, next, please. Now, in variational autoencoders, this is, of course, a very popular method for deep learning, unsupervised deep learning these days. You go very much in the direction of nonlinear ICA, in fact. What they do is that they define that the prior S is white and Gaussian, so uncorrelated Gaussian variables, which means also that they are independent. And then we define a posterior so that we take some arbitrary nonlinear transformation F, just exactly the same kind of F pretty much as what we had earlier, plus of S, plus then N, which is a noise term. Now, yes, this looks very much like some kind of a nonlinear ICA with noise added, but it's obviously not identifiable because the latent variables are Gaussian, and well, there's two reasons why it's not identifiable. First, we have the Darmar construction, But we don't even need to go to the diagonal construction. We can more here. It's even more trivially unidentifiable, which is because the latent variables are independent and Gaussian. So in fact, any orthogonal rotation of those variables is equivalent. It's exactly the same indeterminacy that we have in linear factor analysis. So VAE is kind of in a sense like unidentifiable because of these two different reasons. Okay, so what can we do? Yes, next slide, please. Okay, what we can do is use a trick that again has actually been proposed a little bit earlier by people in self-supervised learning, but we don't do it in a self-supervised learning here. We do it in a principled maximum likelihood way, but the point is that you could condition these deep latent variable models by another variable. Like Arangelovic and Zisserman had the idea that, okay, when you have video, you also usually have audio. So what is if you kind of use the audio to better learn video features or image features? And well, here's some results that they had. So based on this idea, they claim that, well, they actually get like images that corresponds to some higher order categories. Like if you look at the leftmost column, you see that, well, basically there it's all about playing the guitar. The second leftmost column has some greenery. I'm not actually quite sure. It's too small, but I don't know if it's related to golf or something. I don't know. Anyway, so what we can do, we take a probabilistic formulation of this, which is that we assume that we have that this additional variable u basically modulates the distributions of the independent components p, s, I given u. This in fact includes several basically it includes more or less the previous frameworks that we had. If we say that u is something like the time index, then it is actually it's modeling non-stationarity. Or it is modeling autocorrelations if u is actually equal to the history. So this is actually a very flexible framework where we just say that we have some additional variable that modulates the independent components, and it doesn't have to be additional variable. It can actually be something like history or the time index. Okay, next please. Okay, so okay, as I just showed actually or said, is that the original model of VAE, the original deep latent variable model, is not identifiable. So in fact, we could but VAE is actually an interesting method. I would just say that what it is actually doing is more like PCA. What it is doing is a nonlinear dimension reduction, but it is not doing ICA. It doesn't actually find the original independent components, separate sources or anything like that, because it's not identifiable. But okay, so what we do, next please. So what we do in order to make VAE identifiable is to use this idea of some conditioning variable like the audio for video or history for time series. So assuming that, now we assume that these SIs are actually conditionally independent given U, and the different values of U somehow modulate the distributions of U sufficiently. Then we can actually prove that this model is identifiable. So we have some more constraints again. We see that SI are conditionally independent given U, and then we can kind of basically, in principle, we could evaluate those dependencies for different values of U. But of course, that's not exactly what we do. We do a proper maximum likelihood estimation. Well, actually, variational approximation of a maximum likelihood method. So like this figure here shows that, well, we have performance on the left-hand side, which means basically how well we recover the original independent components. And we see that for our new method, IVAE, we get basically close to 1, while all the other, while ordinary VAE and various kind of variants of VAE which have been proposed, they all have more or less, I think, a chance level performance there. Okay, and then just very quickly, I will mention some various extensions that we have recently developed. So like we have this this time contrastive learning where you manually segment the data. That's of course a bit annoying to have this manual segmentation. So the question is whether it can be learned. And yes, we showed that you can actually have a hidden Markov model that models this segmentation. Okay, so we could actually, well, okay, this goes actually extremely technical, but some of you may be familiar with this theory. So we could actually have a likelihood estimate method also in the noise-free case for an invertible mixing, but then you get a difficult term, the Jacobian of the neural network. There's a lot of work on how to evaluate this, or rather how to simplify the neural network so that it can be evaluated. Well, we recently showed that in fact it can be evaluated for quite a general case using so-called relative gradient, and thus we can actually do this likelihood noise-free likelihood inference efficiently. And finally, then, well, independence, of course, can be seen as a restriction. Some people always complain when I talk about ICA that, well, why do the components have to be independent? Well, so in in a very recent paper, we show how we can actually generalize these frameworks to dependent components. And in fact, we at the same time use energy-based modeling as a kind of which is another kind of a learning principle in addition to self-supervised learning and MLE and variational approximations. Now, actually, just a final point, in fact, on this independence is that, well, some people complain that, well, why do you assume things to be independent? But on the other hand, well, especially I think in this disentanglement literature in deep learning, people kind of want the components to be independent. It is seen as something very useful, kind of a useful way of defining the ground truth. But of course, it's basically fundamentally an empirical question of whether models based on independence assumption or relaxations of that actually give you better components. Next, please. Okay, so then to conclude, well, typical deep learning is supervised and it needs class labels or some other kinds of targets. So if we have no class labels or we have perhaps very few of them, then we go into this unsupervised learning. And independent component analysis is a principled approach, and for unsupervised learning, it has been very successful in the linear case. And so the point here is that it can be made nonlinear, although it's not straightforward. So the fundamental problem is this identifiability. So how can we make the model identifiable, which means that we can actually recover the components that actually created the data, unlike PCA or VAE. And so what we have shown is that we can achieve this by some special assumptions, like one of these three. We can have time series with non-stationarity, or time series with temporal dependencies, or we can have some kind of external auxiliary conditioning variable. And okay, well, sometimes we do this with self-supervised methods, which have the great benefit that they are actually quite easy to implement, but we can also, sometimes we can prefer more principled maximum likelihood methods. And yes, I showed some promising applications on EEG and MEG, but these are, of course, very initial applications, and I hope we can do something much better in the future. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Apo. That was great. If folks have questions, feel free to enter them in the chat or in the Q&A session. Or if you prefer, you can just let us know and we can allow you to ask your own questions by unmuting you.
So there is one question. Find it. To stop my sharing if it is okay. I can share again if it's needed. So the question is from Mike, and he's asking, is the non-stationary identifiability result specific to the non-stationary Gaussian variance model, or does it hold for general non-stationary signal?
Yes, yeah, definitely it's a much more general result. So just for simplicity, I considered here the Gaussian case. Well, in this paper, what we had is that we assume that we have exponential family. We have an exponential family model with an arbitrary number of statistics, sufficient statistics, and then the parameters of the of the exponential family are modulated in some way. We actually have some more recent work submitted probably tonight, so where we relax this assumption of exponential families. But yes, definitely, it's much more general. By the way, I have no clue where I could see these questions.
We'll just read them to you.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Actually, I can't even see them either, Armin. So
yeah. I mean,
think today is weird. So they are in the Q&A and also in the chat. So you can ask your question in the Q&A panel or send it in the. That's a better place, in fact. But there's no other question yet.
Okay. One question I had was if folks want to try out some of this, is there code available at this point? And if so, what would you suggest?
Yeah, well, we have some code available. Now, we actually ran into the problem that in deep learning, everything is advancing so fast that code that's written five years ago doesn't seem to work anymore.
Yeah.
Or something to the effect. So we get like TCL code on the web, but it's TensorFlow, and it may work, but it's a bit of an old version of TensorFlow, and these days anybody I know doesn't want to use TensorFlow anymore. So that's a bit of a problem. We do have really good packages for the IVAE and the energy-based version. Unfortunately, not perhaps for TC, for time contrastive learning or permutation contrastive learning. But some code is definitely available. Yeah.
Okay.
If you go to my homepage and there's a subpage called software, so you should find some links.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so here's one which is how does nonlinear ICA compare to empirical mode decomposition or iterative filtering?
Well, that's a very good, very difficult question, I have to say. So empirical mode decomposition, I have to say I don't completely understand how it works. I'm tempted to think that it's simply something really different, and it probably doesn't have anything to do with nonlinear ICA. Probably does something completely different. That's perhaps the best thing I can actually say. Iterative filtering, I don't know what that means.
Yeah. Given the non-identifiability of nonlinear ICA, do you think that the pursuit of disentangled components in static VAEs is therefore doomed?
Yeah, I think, well, from a purely theoretical perspective, I would say yes, it is doomed. Of course, there's another way. So this theory here considers an arbitrary function f that computes the components or creates the data from components. Well, okay, it's actually two functions, one of them being the inverse of the other. But so in that case, what we need is more statistical structure, like temporal structure, to make the model identifiable. Now, there's another option, which is almost completely unexplored, I suppose because it's too difficult, which is that, well, you could also have identifiability based on some restrictions of these functions. If you say that the functions belong to a certain function class, then presumably they might be identifiable. They should be identifiability. But there's like almost no research on this. We had in '99, we had a paper where actually my co-author proved that in a kind of a very simple two-dimensional case, you can achieve something like this. But other than that, there's almost no identifiability results by restricting nonlinearities. But if we optimistically, but this way of thinking kind of gives hope and says that, well, maybe the VAE on static images is not doomed if you actually like kind of know how to properly restrict your nonlinearities. But that's kind of a very hand-wavy thing, and I cannot really say anything about anything rigorous.
What is the biggest benefit of nonlinear ICA compared to other similar methods? Dimensionality reduction, better, faster learning. What else?
Yeah, that's of course a very good and crucial question. Well, I think the point in identifiability is partly that actually the model the solution is is properly defined. So in fact, maybe I have to go back to the question of VAE that I just said. Well, in fact, if you think about just the basic VAE, where you have Gaussian latent variables, then in fact you clearly see that any objective function is completely independent, completely constant when you rotate your components. So even if you did some kind of intelligent restriction of the nonlinearities, you will always have this rotation indeterminacy. So the point is, one point is that, well, if your model is not identifiable, it's simply the solution may not be well defined. You may get like many different kinds of solutions which are equally good based on the your model fitting criterion. And so in that sense, it's just, if you want to find some kind of a decomposition of brain activity, you just get a lot of different decompositions, and you have no clue, and your method doesn't actually say which one is the best in any way. Well, nonlinear ICA, it would give you a well-defined solution, more or less like a single well-defined solution up to some trivial indeterminacies. So that's one point. Well, another point is that, well, compared to like heuristic self-supervised learning, well, nonlinear ICA will enable you to do like proper probabilistic inference, which means that you can do things like denoising of your data, or perhaps reconstruct missing data using well-known principled principles of probabilistic inference. Of course, this can be done by other probabilistic methods as well. That is true. But now I'm comparing with heuristic self-supervised learning. And then, okay, maybe another reason why nonlinear ICA is useful, that, well, at least I think that the fact that we know that the method is able to find the original components from a nonlinear mixing, it gives me some kind of a more faith in the method that it is actually doing something meaningful. Mm-hmm. Whether that convinces other people, I don't know, but at least I am convinced.
Yeah, I would comment on just from the application side. If you just compare nonlinear ICA to linear ICA, we see some evidence of nonlinear relationships in neuroimaging data that would not be captured well and are not captured well by linear ICA. So in that case, you can in some cases identify signals that you would have otherwise missed, brain sources, or separate signals, like you said, artifacts, but not only that, networks that are relevant and of interest that you would have missed otherwise. So I think there's a whole bunch of benefits on the application side that are just beginning to be explored.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So I was actually just comparing with other deep learning methods, but yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thanks for your comments on the comparison to linear ICA.
Yes, exactly. Let's see. There's another question about can you elaborate on the connections with blind deconvolution?
Right. Yeah. Yes. So I mean, in the linear case, we know that ICA and blind deconvolution are very closely related. In fact, blind deconvolution is, in a sense, basically a special case of ICA. So, and you can take some ICA algorithms, especially fast ICA. Fast ICA is able to estimate just one independent component. Now you can actually use this exactly as a blind deconvolution method. It is nothing else. If you just take time windows, input them as input to your algorithm, fast ICA will do blind deconvolution. So yes, well, then the good question is that what if we want to do some kind of a nonlinear blind deconvolution? I haven't actually thought about that so much. But I suppose it should be possible in the same way. I think the connection between nonlinear ICA and nonlinear blind deconvolution should be just the same as in the linear case. And so we could take windows of some time series. Let's say we had one time series, one-dimensional time series. We take windows, input them as a data to a nonlinear ICA method, and I would assume that will be seen as a method for blind deconvolution. Then you have to, okay, then you have to, well, actually not exactly the same algorithm. Then you have to basically take into account the fact that you are kind of estimating only one independent component. Actually, the other independent components are the same, but just with time lags. Yeah, so but I suppose by a simple modification of nonlinear ICA algorithms, you would be able to do nonlinear blind deconvolution. Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
Okay, great.